You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello and welcome to Switched On Australia, the podcast about the people, ideas and technologies shaping our clean energy future. I'm Anne Delaney. Great to have you with me. For years, we've heard warnings about the gas death spiral. As more and more households make the switch to electric, fewer are left paying for the pipes buried under our streets, which carry the gas. The danger is that those left behind, often renters, apartment dwellers and low-income households, will end up trapped, stuck with rising bills for a service they can't easily leave. Energy Consumers Australia says the rules governing gas need to change now to stop this problem getting worse. They want new gas users to pay the full cost of new connections. Rather than spreading it across existing gas users, which happens now. They're also calling for limits on how quickly gas companies can write down the value of their networks. This is a practice that shifts financial risk away from investors and onto households. And they want fairer, cheaper disconnection options so people can leave gas without being slugged with fees. Brian Spak is the General Manager of Advocacy and Policy at Energy Consumers Australia. And I began by asking him why he thinks the rules that govern our gas system need reforming.
The basic reason is that the regulations that govern the gas networks, these are particularly the pipelines underneath our neighborhoods. The regulations that govern them aren't fit for purpose. They were designed around the concept that the gas network would always grow. And they make sense for a gas network that continues to grow. What we know is happening right now, or is about to happen, is that the gas network is going to shrink or become less used. And that's really and that creates this need to change the regulatory framework that surrounds those gas networks.
And if we don't change those regulations, what's going to happen?
So we know with a lot of confidence, actually, what's going to happen, and that's the people who are least able or least willing to go all electric are going to end up paying very, very high gas bills simply to stay connected to the gas network. So these would be low-income households, renters, people that live in apartments, and have more challenges associated with going all electric because, if you're a renter, you don't necessarily, decide how your unit is heated. So it's really up to somebody else whether or not you get electrified. And so if you're just stuck on the gas network and relying on the gas network, somehow those costs have to get repaid, the cost to the gas network. And right now, the way the regulations work is that as the costs basically stay the same. The cost of the whole gas network stay the same. And as more and more customers leave the gas network, then there's a smaller base of customers to repay it. And so basically you've got you have to recover the fixed costs of the gas network among a smaller population of households and consumers.
I mean, this is the gas death spiral, which we've been talking about for some years, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Because of the pending gas death spiral, that's why we pitch these rule changes, because we can't stop that gas spiral or that death spiral, sorry. And these regulations don't solve the problem, but they start to solve the problem. And that's it. That raises an important point that there were really two fundamental reasons why we raised these rule changes. One was to make the regulations more fit for purpose, but just as much as that, it was also to raise the specter of this issue because there are parts of it that can be solved with making the gas network or gas regulations better, but there are bigger policy challenges at play here, and we really just wanted to put those on the agenda for government and to start a more public conversation about this issue, because we could see, the the death spiral coming, as you call it, and haven't seen a lot of attention being paid by jurisdictional governments about how to solve this problem. And then the problem only gets worse the longer we wait to try and address it.
So before we look at some of those bigger policy changes that you think are necessary, let's look at some of what you are proposing. Now, one of the rule changes you want is to require new gas customers to pay the upfront costs of connecting to the gas network. Now, before we look at why you want that rule change, just explain how new connections are currently paid for.
Yeah. So so maybe a good example would be you live in a house with a little bit of land and you decide to build a granny flat and you want to run gas to that granny flat.
Mm.
That's actually probably a pretty small cost to the network to expand the gas network that way, to the network business to do it. And they would socialize most, but not all of that cost. So I don't know. Let's say it cost $5,000 to do it. I'm just making up a number. I don't know how much that would cost. Maybe you pay $1,000 and the other $4,000 gets recovered from the entire customer base.
So they spread the cost to the existing users, essentially.
That's right. And so they put it into their regulated asset base, which is a fancy phrase that just means all their capital, all
All
their
the
capital.
pipes and networks and infrastructure.
That's right. It's pretty much for a gas network. It's pretty much a lot of pipes,
Yes.
um, and valves and stuff like that. So that's one instance. The more regular instance is a new developer decides to build a new housing estate.
Mm.
They run a gas line, a relatively bigger pipe to the whole new estate, and then they run a number of pipelines that would connect each of the new premises to the estate. And so right now that, maybe that costs $100,000 and that developer pays some of those costs. I don't know exactly how much, maybe half. So they would pay 50,000 and the other 50,000 would be spread among the existing customer base. So every 5 years, the gas network businesses, they have to go to the regulator and ask, these are what we expect to spend over the next 5 years between capital expense, which we talked about, and operating expense. And then the regulator, there's a little argy-bargy between the regulator and the network business about exactly how much they should spend over the next 5 years. And then something gets agreed to, then they recover that cost through tariffs over that time. When you look at those expenditure plans that the networks put in front of the regulator, it actually turns out that the connection costs, this issue that we're talking about, is typically the biggest cost. It's certainly the biggest capital cost in networks. And
Mhm.
so so of all the costs that they're passing on to all of their users, it tends to be this sort of cost of connecting new customers. And this issue where that actually makes sense for a growing network. Because if customer numbers are always growing, it's kind of a benefit to have more people in the pool. You've got a bigger customer base to recover those costs. And the whole thing worked efficiently that way. That's why the regulations were written that way. Now it's problematic in multiple ways. It does two things if we just left that regulation as it is. First of all, it doesn't give the developer or the homeowner or whomever is making that decision to connect to the gas network, it doesn't actually show them what the true cost of their
Yes.
connection is. Secondly, it also adds more money to this regulated asset base, to the capital expense that networks across Australia hold. The total size of that of gas distribution networks regulated asset base is $11 billion in Australia. And that's a really important number actually, because that $11 billion has to get paid one way or the other. And it's uncertain right now who's going to pay it. And if we don't fix some of these regulations and some of the policy that sits around it, the expectation is that consumers are going to pay all of that. And so one of the fundamental things we're doing with all these rule changes is trying to reduce that $11 billion or not make it any worse. We're trying to really make sure that it doesn't get any bigger. There's the old saying, if you're in a hole, stop digging. When it comes to the gas distribution network, we are quite literally still digging. We're still digging the network under the ground, and we need to stop. Frankly, we would prefer that governments across Australia did what they've done in the ACT and Victoria, which is for households, say that you can no longer connect to the gas network. That new household, that residential building is going to save money by being all electric from the get-go
Yeah.
in pretty much in every instance. And so,
I was just going to say, so but by making people pay for new connections as opposed to spreading that cost to the existing gas consumers, you're trying to get people to focus on that additional cost of installing gas, because otherwise it's somewhat hidden from new customers.
yeah, that's right. Although it's unclear how significant of a difference that will make. For example, in that, and I'm using made up numbers because unfortunately, I actually don't know the real numbers. But in that instance, let's say it costs $1,000 to connect the granny flat to the gas network. Maybe you are using it for your, mother-in-law or something, and they really like to cook with gas. Maybe, the $1,000 seems, yeah, okay, I'll just pay the 1,000. It would have been $500. Now it's 1,000, and I'll just pay the 1,000. It may or may not make that big of a difference. It should make some difference on the margin to stopping gas connections. But as important or more important is that we don't add more money to that regulated asset base, because that's the money that's got to get paid off. Because otherwise, what happens with that part of the capital is there's an assumption that that pipeline is going to be used and useful for the next
Mm.
60 or 80 years, and we're not going to hit net zero targets that are, this is government policy at this point. We're just not going to hit those targets cost effectively if we keep using gas for easily electrifiable household uses. That is a place in the economy where it's actually a benefit to customers to reduce emissions,
Yeah.
um, and go all electric. In those instances, we have to take advantage of them, and we don't want to add to this $11 billion problem that we already have. This $11 billion bill that's going to come due, and we got to figure out who's going to pay for it. We don't want that to grow to 12 billion or 13 billion or 15 billion because we keep socializing these connection costs.
So in some ways, it's a short-term solution that you're proposing by making, new customers pay for connections. But I suppose my concern is that making people pay for these new connections isn't it actually punishing people who potentially don't know any better, that gas is going to be a liability in the future, that electrification is such a better option. I mean, who is now still connecting to gas, and do we actually have to ask the question whether or not we need to focus on finding them better options?
Well, I 100% agree that we need to focus on finding them better options and making them aware. Our hope is that actually by making this cost a bit higher and more prominent, that it does help the customer think twice, I guess,
Mm.
about whether or not they really want to connect to the gas network. So one of the issues that we're talking about here is this topic of stranded assets, right?
Yeah.
And assets are typically, in energy land, we typically think about, assets like, the pipelines are an asset, or power plants, or, transformers are assets. But what's really important to realize is that customer devices, appliances are assets too. Those are the
Mm.
assets of a household. And those might become stranded if a customer buys a gas stove or a gas water heater or a gas heater today that they think is going to last them 15 or 20 years. Well, in 20 years, it's 2045.
Exactly.
I mean, all of their neighbors might have left the gas network by that time, and they're still stuck with this gas stove or, gas appliance that they don't want. And no one told them, no one had the courtesy to tell them at the point of sale that, this was actually a bad idea. We've got to find a way to help the whole community understand the risks around this so that they don't make decisions about their own assets and turn those into stranded assets. These are sophisticated investors who have, who've known about these risks for a long time. It's a much different proposition for a household who goes and buys a gas water heater today. If God forbid, your water heater dies and you've got a gas water heater, and you don't know anything about this, you just want to get a hot shower as quickly as you can. So you're just going to take whatever water heater fits most easily into your place, and whatever the repairman has on the truck.
I mean, there are a couple of points here, surely, Brian, where we can do better in terms of actually enabling people to make better decisions, and one is at that point of should they be connecting to gas, but also should they be buying or be able to buy gas appliances which are going to lock them into costs for the next 20 odd years and emissions. Do we need to aim a bit higher here? I mean, you mentioned Victoria and the ACT who are banning new connections for gas. Do we need to put the pressure on other states there? Do we need to put the pressure on phasing out new gas appliances?
We do. There's things that local governments can do that state governments need to do, and that the Commonwealth government should do. And part of what the Commonwealth government is uniquely positioned to do is around appliance sale. I don't know at what point, they just went through a regulatory process in Victoria to look at banning the sale of particular gas appliances in Victoria. I don't know that at a federal level, if and when that's appropriate. At some point, it probably will be, but I'm not sure that's now. But there absolutely should be much more information for consumers when they're making that purchase about the potential risks. I mean, if you think about, I don't buy a carton of eggs without knowing how many hens per hectare there are.
Yes.
And, I don't smoke, but I've seen packs of cigarettes in Australia and they're pretty gross.
Yeah.
They tell you all of the dangers of this product. And the, there are dangers associated with gas, and we don't bother to tell customers about them. So I think, the GEMS scheme, which is the
Minimum energy performance standards.
correct. It's maybe not there specifically, which is on standards and actually saying what is legal and illegal to sell, but around the labeling of appliances and the star system, there's got to be a process where we can help customers at least understand the risks. The thing I've said, which is more of a joke than anything, but you could, package a gas stove with a wrapper of, polar bears or something, on a stranded on an iceberg or something like that. But maybe it's just, maybe it's just a big dollar sign actually that tries to tell the customer that actually you're going to be stuck paying part of the contract when you buy that gas appliance is the assumption that this gas network is going to stay and be connected to you, and that you're going to, pay a fair and affordable price for gas. But right now, the regulations don't give us a lot of confidence that consumers will continue to pay a fair and affordable price for gas because of this big looming issue with the network part of the bill.
Can I look at some of the research which the ECA has done about people's attitudes to gas? You've had your recent consumer survey, which is always really interesting when it comes out because it's all about consumers' attitudes to energy. What specifically did you garner this time round about attitudes to gas?
So we've asked a lot of questions around gas. I mean, so we always ask general questions about gas, but we've asked a lot, more particularly here in the last two surveys. So one that came out in autumn 2025 and one from around this time last year, from spring of last year. So those are our two most recent ones. So maybe just to zoom out, about half of the households in Australia have piped gas into their house. We know that from the networks themselves. When we ask that question via our survey, we get similar responses. So we get a little over 56% of households tell us that they have piped gas at home.
And it's higher in certain states than others, obviously, Victoria and ACT in particular.
That's correct. It's much different in the States. Queensland and Tasmania are much different. They have much smaller numbers of connections for much different reasons. But because of that, the way that their networks are regulated is actually different. So most of what we're talking about today really applies to South Australia, Victoria, ACT, New South Wales, and WA. It's a different regulatory structure around the gas networks. They're not price regulated in the way that they are in the other states. So when we ask customers what energy sources they use at home. Cooktops, as you might expect, are the most common gas appliance. A little bit more than, or half of all homes have gas cooktops. Water heaters, it's nearly half across Australia. Out of all households, 46% of households have gas water heat. And then about a quarter of households, or just under a quarter, 23%, use gas to heat their homes. So we then ask customers if they have gas, are they interested in switching to gas or electric for these different use cases, for heating their home or for your cooktop or for your water heater? Or if they're on electricity, would they prefer gas or electricity if they were going to change? And so when we ask those questions, what we find the general attitude is people like what they have. People who have gas prefer to stay on gas. People who have electricity prefer to stay on electricity. But by comparison, more gas customers would prefer to use electricity in the future than electricity customers would prefer to use gas, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe the most interesting question is around, we ask households about their intention to cancel their gas supply at home. And we find that about 30% of current gas users expect to cancel their household gas supply within 10 years. And so that's one indication of the fact that right now, if the gas bill is shared between 100 households, in the future it's going to be shared between, in 10 years, it's going to be shared between 70. And so if the costs just stay the same, everybody's going to pay more because, there's 30% fewer people to pay the bill.
Yeah, which actually brings us back to some of the proposed rule changes that you're looking at, because, the gas industry is clearly aware of, the potential of all of this happening, and the Australian Energy Regulator is also aware. They've actually approved gas networks using what they call accelerated depreciation to reduce the risk of stranded assets that we were talking about. But tell me, what impact do you think that's going to have on consumers?
Yeah, so accelerated depreciation, it's a complicated concept, but basically the fundamental idea is, what if you pay off your mortgage faster? It's basically like prepaying more of your mortgage so you don't owe quite as much on the back end. And the gas networks want to do this. They propose doing this because they're worried about the risk that they're not going to get paid back for their pipelines.
Yeah.
Um,
get the money faster.
Yeah, and the regulator is in a tough spot on this. I should say, but the regulator has approved them doing so. In the most part, they're trying to temper the amount. So their logic is basically, okay, we'll let you collect some money early, but not so much that it's going to make a big difference on bills. There's a certain logic that you can see there, but in practice, what ends up happening, and what we've done some additional analysis. So we do a lot of research, not just of surveying customers, but like sort of hard cost economic research. So Gemina is the gas network that serves nearly all of New South Wales. In their original proposal, I mentioned before, every 5 years, the gas networks have to go in front of the regulator and ask for their costs to be recovered. So the original proposal was going to have every household pay another $130 over the 5 years. So it's more than 1 million households in New South Wales. And so we did a little bit of analysis to basically say, like, okay, if you do this, is this actually going to make is this going to make a dent on this stranded asset problem? And the answer is not really.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really solve this issue. There's a bit of a debate, I suppose, about what is the value of accelerated depreciation. So, the way that the regulator historically has framed it is to say that it shifts costs between consumers, basically. And it says today's consumers pay more, so future consumers pay less. And that was their original argument, at least, for approving accelerated depreciation. I disagree. I
Yeah.
don't think that's a proper framing of the issue. I think what's happening is that gas consumers are paying more now, so network investors reduce their losses
Their
later.
loss. Exactly. Yeah.
And so it's a wealth transfer, arguably, between networks and consumers. Now, some of that might actually be appropriate. I mean, I mentioned before we've got this $11 billion problem, which is that's the stranded asset problem. That's the value of these distribution pipelines today, and somebody's got to pay it off. And there's only so many people you can look to. There's gas consumers, there's the network investors, and there's government. Beside that, it's difficult for me to identify who might pay. Some money is going to be paid by consumers, some needs to be paid by network investors, and some probably should be paid by government.
So splitting the costs essentially rather than letting existing gas customers have to pay the full caboodle.
Exactly. Right. And so that's our concern, is that right now the way the gas regulations are written and the way that the AER is implementing them and the broader debate around this is just this assumption that, well, consumers are on the hook for all of it.
Yeah.
And we don't think that's fair. And so what our rule change tries to do is say, can we put the brakes on accelerated depreciation until and unless the networks themselves cop some of the losses, are quite explicit about all the ways that they're trying to reduce risk themselves from their network. So one of the really odd things, if you have the misfortune of spending a lot of time digging into these 5 yearly plans that gas networks put up, is they would ask, on the one hand, they ask for accelerated depreciation. It's basically saying we see a future risk to our network, so we think customers should pay more now to reduce this risk in the future. And then on the next page of their proposal, they're asking for a bunch of additional expenditure for connections or for meter replacements or, to build their network in some other way. And it just doesn't make sense to us that you can't have it both ways. You can't say there's a risk to us,
Yeah.
and so consumers need to pay to reduce that. And in the meanwhile, we're also going to expand our capital, and we want
And consumers have to pay for it.
and consumers have to pay for it.
Yeah.
Heads we win, tails you lose.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
and so that's the fundamental issue that we want to see addressed. The Justice and Equity Center, another consumer advocacy organization, has themselves put in a rule change on this, and their suggestion is that the rules should change and just say accelerated depreciation is not allowed ever, or it's stopped. It basically stops it in the rules, and the regulator can no longer allow accelerated depreciation. We didn't go that far. We actually said, maybe there's instances where this is an appropriate regulatory tool, but it's got to be a more balanced discussion where the networks themselves are taking some of the losses and they're making more proactive plans about how to ensure that customers pay a fair and affordable price for gas as long as they use it.
Mm. You've raised the issue of, who should pay: consumers, government, industry. Okay. And as you said, it's hard to see who else we can put into that mix. But there has been a suggestion by Ron Ben David, industry veteran. He's proposed that electricity distribution networks should underwrite some of these costs from the gas network declining, because it's the electricity networks that are going to grow. They're going to have the long lifespan in a decarbonised economy. What's your view of that sort of a strategy?
Um, there's some merit to it, arguably. So I'm not against the idea. I think I need to explore it a bit more. I will say that in instances where, and this happens in the ACT, in AusNet, in Melbourne or in Victoria as well, I believe, where, and you'll see it overseas as well, where one business owns both the gas and electricity distribution networks in the same service area. So Gemina, which I mentioned before, is sort of like that, but not enough. So they own the gas distribution network in New South Wales and then part of the electricity distribution network in Victoria. So basically different, they have different households. They have different assets connected in different places, and that doesn't really help you. But where it's the same location, then it makes it a little bit easier because effectively for that business, what they lose on one side of the ledger, they earn on the other. The other thing that off the top of my head, I want to say that it's more or less the value of the electricity distribution networks, the regulated asset base there is about 90 billion, 88 billion. So much bigger, like 8 times or 9 times or something bigger than the value of that gas distribution network. And there's lots of reasons why that is. But, it doesn't look such an imposition on those businesses. Maybe that's appropriate. I think we need a really thoughtful and full discussion about it. As you get into the detail around this, there are so many devils hidden in here, and we need jurisdictional governments to come to the table and have that discussion in a fulsome way so that we can not only solve these problems, but also, just as we were talking about before, like raise this issue so that in a year or 2 years, when someone goes to buy, when their gas water heater dies, they're a little bit more thoughtful about how they should replace it. Some of it to us is we need a more public discussion about these things because it'll make it make the problems easier to solve if people at the time of appliance replacement leave the network.
Do we also need to force the gas industry to be a bit more forthcoming with their plans?
Yes, very much, and that's one of our rule changes actually. So focuses on that. It's quite striking actually. We talk a lot about plans, but they're almost always electricity plans.
Mhm.
So, your listeners might know of the integrated system plan, which is the big plan that the market operator puts out every 2 years. In even that name, integrated system plan, makes it seem like it would be, well, an integrated plan about the energy system.
Yes.
But it's not that actually. It doesn't look really at gas at all. And to the extent that people have tried to make it look at gas, it focuses more on the big gas pipelines and whether or not they can supply generators, which is a whole different topic. It's a wholly different thing and may be appropriate. We may need gas for generators for a while, but and the economics don't look the same as they do for replacing your water heater. It's just so it's a different thing. But also, there's one of my favorite acronyms in energy land is the DAPR, which is the DAPR and the TAPR are the distribution annual planning report for the electricity distribution networks, and then the same one for transmission companies. And so and they have to do that every year. These are electricity networks, but gas networks don't have to do that at all. Every 5 years, they have to come in and sort of say what their plan is for the next 5 years and how much money they need. But that's not really a plan, and it doesn't look at all around the. More recently, some of them have started to introduce these concepts around risk, somewhat to introduce this idea of accelerated depreciation, getting paid earlier, somewhat to be thoughtful themselves about how they should manage their business. Like I live in Newcastle. The part of Newcastle I live on is kind of like a peninsula. And you can imagine in a peninsula that, maybe there's 1,000 households that are connected to the gas network today. In the next 10 years, people start slowly but surely start to realize, that they should get off gas and they get solar and they want to use more electricity because it's so much cheaper and, they're worried about the health of their children or, whatever reason. Everybody decides to get off gas and we're down. So we had 1,000 gas households and now we've only got 30. You still have all these pipelines just to serve, 3% of the original customer base there. At that point, it might make a lot more sense for the New South Wales government or Newcastle Council or those two in conjunction with Gemina or the electricity or Osgrid, who's the electricity distributor here, or somebody to all come up with a plan to basically just help those 30 households who probably are renters, probably are low income, can't afford, or maybe just are unwilling to get off gas, and to really explain to them what the issue is, how it's costing them and their neighbors more by staying connected to gas, and just help those last households get off. We could actually plan to do that. We could watch where where people are leaving the network in more sufficient numbers, and then enable local governments and state governments and and community groups to have these discussions about, okay, how do we solve this? How do we just kind of get everybody off gas here? And right now we don't have the data to do that.
Right. So if we knew, say, of a whole street that, half the people were thinking about getting off gas or even more were thinking of getting off gas, you could decommission an entire street as opposed to just single houses having to do it themselves individually.
Exactly. Yeah. The concept, the term that's sometimes used is pruning the gas network. So you just like
Right.
prune a tree. Yeah.
Because doing it individually surely is a higher cost. And I know that a couple of years ago we were hearing examples of householders, single householders, being charged up to $1,200 to disconnect. Basically, as the gas industry is probably trying to disincentivize disconnections. Is that still happening?
Uh, yes. And this is another one of those places where the devil's in the detail here. So, this is another one of the rule changes. We didn't introduce this one. Justice and Equity Center did, around trying to solve this disconnection issue. And it's a hard problem. So there's a couple different things that can happen. If you don't want gas in your home anymore, you can sort of just cap the line and basically just stop, have like a quick, cheap, easy disconnection. It still probably requires someone to come out to your house and pay a visit. So maybe 100, $200 for that. And then there's the other cost of actually ripping the pipes out, and that does have a higher cost. And it's like, yeah, it's been seen to be $1,000 or $1,100. So in Victoria, what happened is the networks themselves said, yeah, we want to charge customers $1,100, and the AER said, no, we think it's better, but this now we come into this issue with the regulated asset base and who pays for what. What um, the regulator said is, I think you should just charge the disconnecting customers $200 and socialize the other $900 or $800 of the cost. And so put that on the rest of the customer base. And so it's one of these things where the money's got to come from somewhere, right? And so part of solving this problem intelligently requires us to understand what's the actual risk and the safety risk associated with the pipes staying in
Still being
place.
there, yeah.
And so each state has its own safety regulator, which is probably an issue on this. And I'm not a safety regulator, so I don't, what's most important is that everybody stays safe and no one gets hurt in the gas transition. So, above all, like we're talking about cutting costs from gas networks. They still need to pay the appropriate cost for safety. The regulator publishes data on what they call dormant connections. And so these might be holiday homes where people don't live there 6 months out of the year or whatever. They have a gas connection, but they're not using gas. There's, I think, 180,000 of those around the
Mhm.
country, which is a lot. And so, if there's a safety risk associated with leaving a customer who wants to get off the gas network connected, it also applies to a lot of these dormant connections, because some of them are holiday homes, but some of them are people who just aren't using gas anymore.
Yeah.
And we don't really know what that is. So in the ACT safety regulator, their observation is that they think the big risk of being connected to the gas network is when the house is sold. They think it's fine to leave the pipes in place if you live in your house and you decide to get off the gas network, but you still live there. Their argument is basically, well, because you live there and you used to have gas, you know that there's gas pipelines near your house, and you'll be careful when you dig and everything like that. And so their proposition, which I don't think has gone all the way through, but is likely to go through, basically would say you just pay that big $1,000 cost to disconnect when the house is sold. And also that the gas network can kind of be thoughtful then about about trying to do many households all at the same time. I think there's a lot of value in that approach from a policy perspective. I can't comment about the safety value of it, but if that is a safe approach, then I think, a couple things happen. One is the cost gets recovered when you buy or sell a house. And, I've done that a few times in my life. And, there's just a long list of costs when
Yeah.
and you don't know what they
You're not
are.
going to notice the $1,000 disconnection fee for your gas that much, will you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it has that benefit. And it also just kind of allows the network themselves to maybe reduce costs by doing many at the same time because they've seen all these ones coming off, or they at that point they know that everybody's going to come off, and maybe they take yours out now, even if you've not sold your house, and they collect the money later when you sell. That seems to have a lot of promise, that idea, but
Mm.
it's only an ACT thing right now, and the safety regulators in the other states see this issue differently. So we've got to come to a common understanding of this, because that's a big one.
It's still that solution, though, it's still putting it back on the consumers primarily. That's what it seems to me to be doing.
Yeah, well, but that's true. I mean, I think maybe the starkest contrast of that topic is if you just buy a house, someone sells their house, someone moves and sells their house to you, and it has a gas connection. You don't want gas. You don't own the pipelines. Somebody else does, the network. Now you've bought the house, and you've got to pay to no longer have these pipes that you don't want, that you never wanted. I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, there's some combination of governments, consumers, and networks need to pay, and it shouldn't, just like all the rest of it, not all of it should go on the
On
consumer. Yeah.
consumers, yeah. Just a final question, Brian. I mean, with the declining use of gas in, our homes, and the potential rising costs for the existing group of gas users, and all these equity impacts that clearly we've been talking about. I mean, if these rising costs and equity impacts are not managed properly, what impact do you think that this is going to have on public support for the energy transition?
Oh, it's going to have terrible support. It is going to have a terrible backlash. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a question we ask in our survey, is basically, do you support the energy transition? And um, are you aware of why there's an energy transition? And do you support government's action on climate change? I don't think we asked that question exactly, but we ask questions around, sort of broadly around the transition. People generally more are supportive than are against it. But we ask a question that, do you feel like the government or anyone else has clearly explained what the energy transition means for your household? And we get a very small answer to that. I think it's only 20% of households say that they agree, that they feel like anyone has
Been
been informed
informed.
about what the transition means for them. And what the transition means for most households is not that much, really, but it means you're not going to use gas at home anymore. You're going to drive an electric vehicle sooner or later. You might get solar on your roof if you weren't thinking about that already, maybe a battery in the garage. But the things that you have today that you're not going to have in the future are an internal combustion engine vehicle and gas appliances. And no one wants to tell anybody that story. And I understand why. Consumers want to have choice around how they heat their home and make their meal and cook their meals. So we have to be really careful about how we have that conversation and make sure that people understand the reasons why. But giving ourselves more time to talk about it and to explain why is going to make the transition easier than just trying, to put our heads in the sand and pretend that there's not a reckoning coming.
Yeah.
And in the meanwhile, we can help avoid, these households from buying their own stranded assets, from buying when their water heater dies, or, a landlord, when the water heater dies in a unit that they own, that they're thoughtful enough to say, oh, I better, or I have to replace that with an electric alternative, so I don't screw over, my tenants. Yeah. So I do think that public support is about being explicit about this in an intelligent way. I took a picture of a Bunnings one day where there was, maybe it was Costco. There was a gas stove and gas cooktop adjacent to a refrigerator. And so the electric refrigerator has all sorts of labels telling you about its energy use and whether or not it's more or less efficient and the star rating and all that. There's no labeling whatsoever on those
I
gas
know.
appliances. We just need to help consumers a little bit here. I mean, we don't need to, be alarmist about it, but we just need to be real with people about the transition that's happening and really, what is likely to be a benefit for them.
Yeah, definitely being clearer. Brian Spak, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Well, thank you, Anne. It was a pleasure.
And Brian Spak is the General Manager of Advocacy and Policy at Energy Consumers Australia. The big takeaway here is that we can't just leave households to absorb the costs of a shrinking gas network. As Brian said, the bill for $11 billion worth of pipes has to be paid somehow, and unless governments and regulators step in, it's the most vulnerable consumers who will end up carrying the load. I'll keep you posted when and if the energy regulator takes up any of the rule changes that Energy Consumers Australia are proposing. If you'd like to dive deeper into the type of issues we've been discussing today, you can find more on our websites, Renew Economy and One Step Off the Grid. And of course, you'll find every episode of Switched On Australia wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Anne Delaney. Thanks for listening, and join me next time as we explore more of the ideas shaping Australia's clean energy future.